Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Leading in a Crisis podcast. On this podcast, we share stories from the front lines of crisis communications. We deliver this through interviews, storytelling, and lessons learned shared from experienced crisis leaders. I'm Tom Mueller. If you'd like to email the show, you can drop me a line at tom@leadinginacrisis.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And special welcome to our new listeners from around the world. In the last few weeks, we've added new listeners in Brazil, Argentina, and Vietnam. That's in addition to our already global footprint across the US, Europe, Asia, and Australia, New Zealand. So welcome, everybody. We're glad to have you with us. On today's episode, we are heading to space. NASA has just completed the Artemis II mission that flew astronauts around the moon and back. And that got us thinking about crisis communications around the space program. So our guest today is James Hartsfield, a veteran communications professional who worked much of his career at NASA's Johnson Space Center here in Houston. James, welcome to the show.
Hey, Tom, thank you. And it's good to speak with you. And I'm going to tell your listeners, right? I say I've known you for now 41 years. I'd hate to count them, but back
Ouch.
in the day, before our careers were really anything, both of our careers, we were kind of nobodies. And I'm going to tell them I took your place at a small newspaper that we both ended up at that area, both because of a natural attraction to the beach. And you had moved up, and I took your spot. And who the heck knew what would unfold in the next lifetime, right? But it's a crazy world, isn't it? And it's been awesome.
It is a crazy world. That newspaper job interview was literally on my way to the beach, and I was in shorts. I actually threw on a collared shirt, for the interview, but I was really headed to the beach, and that was too funny. I think you have a similar story to that, don't you?
Yeah, I was, the interstate ends there in Galveston, right? And so maybe that's why I ended up there. I don't know. I think there's a lot of people that end up there just because you can't drive any further, right? It ends right there. But yeah, I went to that interview and then I said, well, the beach is a good place. I didn't know what I wanted to do but I said I want to live on the beach and I wanted to be in Texas, and there was that paper. So, interviewing in the morning, and in the afternoon I was drinking a cold one in the sand, so it was good. And I never regret those choices. They were
Yeah,
fantastic. They worked
absolutely.
out well for
They
both of
did.
us.
And James and I also share a love of sailing. And back in those days, James, I remember you actually lived aboard a 36-foot sloop for a while.
I did, yes, yeah, 36-foot Islander Freeport, which I had restored. I had worked on and fixed up for a couple of years, and I had it in a slip under an apartment at the time. But then I said, well, gee, it's nicer than my apartment. I think I'll move on board, and allowed me to move around and be a bit of a gypsy while I was working still, though, but I could live in Galveston or up here in Clear Lake, and also it had good parallels to working at NASA. A sailboat, a boat has similar systems to a spacecraft in some. It sounds crazy, but it's a
Hmm.
lot of self-contained. So as I was learning things like that, the boat was interesting to be on, and enjoyed it. But now you sailed on much bigger boats, so yeah. I don't know if people know that you were an Alyssa crew member, and you used to climb up how many stories into that old ship
Yeah, it's
rigging and unfurl
110
sails
foot.
in
Yeah.
rough water. And I I wouldn't do that, Tom. I'd sail on that 36-foot sloop, but I'm not going to be in the tall mast ship rigging. So
Yep, that was the old 1877 square rig ship Alyssa, which is docked down in Galveston. So a historic ship that still sails today. So yeah, we went and learned how to sail that big beast and took her out sailing in the Gulf of America. Well, hey, let's talk space stuff, James. We've talked some personal history here. How about your professional history? Give our listeners a kind of rundown on your career.
sure. Well, first of all, I want to, since we're going to, you cannot mention space today without me giving a huge emotional congratulations to my team mates, former teammates at NASA for a great Artemis II mission. We had been working toward that mission. When I left NASA about a year ago, my main thing had been preparing for that flight and preparing the team of communicators there at the Johnson Space Center for that flight. And so it was just amazing. I was lucky. My wife and I were invited to go to the launch by NASA. So we saw it launch. And then I watched the landing here last week, Friday. And it was just, it was wonderful all throughout the mission to hear the voices of all my team, many of who I've trained and hired. And I always told them, I repeated this phrase to them a lot over the years, that they were the right people in the right place at the right time to tell the world that story. And they certainly bore that truth out in this great, magnificent mission.
Yeah, it was a very successful mission, and everybody's just cheering for NASA on the success of this. There's a lot of things happening out in the space race these days. But James, how long were you at NASA then?
Sure. So I was at NASA a total of 38 years, right? I started there in 1988. I'd worked at the paper that we talked about for several years, 3 years. Moved up. There were only like three people at the paper, right? So moving up was, but managing editor for the last year and a half or so, and I was doing that job when the Challenger accident happened, and I went up to the Space Center to cover it for the paper. President Ronald Reagan, doing his memorial service there. I had not been to NASA or the Space Center since I was a kid in the '60s, when my parents came down once and we toured during Apollo. So I said, wow, okay, the Space Center's here and the beach. Didn't really remember it.
We were
And
so clueless in those younger years.
yeah. And then I was looking for a place to move on to, because I'd been at the paper for a while and things were going well there. But I said, well, I'll go up there and try my hand there. And I stuck my foot in the door. It's a bit of a story, but I did. I called up to the communications department there, and I told them that I wanted to interview one of their communicators who lived in Galveston County, just to do a profile story on him for the paper. And they set me up a time to go in there, and I went in, and it was a couple of the folks, Jack Raleigh and Doug Ward, two of the voices that you were prominent during Apollo 11, that were the voices of NASA during Apollo 11, and they were going to be interviewed by me, they thought, but I had shown up with all my clips and all my photos and all my resume. And I walked in right away and I said, look, truth is, I'm looking for a job. I'm not here to interview you. And they were super gracious, and they talked with me for probably an hour and a half. And they said, hey, you look great on some of your things, but we don't have an opening right now. But if you'll go over to this other building on site and fill out an application form, we'll get you in our system. This was before electronic anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I went over to that building, I pulled this form up, and I was cynical newspaper guy like you were, because that was one of the things about when you jump from papers to communications, it was a jump of some kinds, right? But
It was.
then, they handed me a form that was, no kidding, it was an accordion form, probably 5.5 feet long, both sides. And I said, wow, okay, I got to take this home because there's a lot more than I can remember here. And so I'm driving home in a $400 automobile I owned, and the air conditioners, it didn't have an air conditioner. So I had the windows rolled down. I'm driving down the freeway. I have that form sitting in the passenger seat. It's flopping in the breeze. And I said to myself, I said, okay, yeah, NASA, put me in your computer, blah. And I threw it out the window. I never filled it out. And this story would never happen today, right? But then about a month and a half, 2 months later, I get a call from Jack Riley, the one of the guys I interviewed with, and he said, "Hey, James, we have an opening now, and we'd be interested in hiring you, but you never filled out that form, so we can't even think about you." They still have my resume, and so heck, I hooked it back up there and filled out the form, and then it was 38 years. So I started right before the return to flight after Challenger, which was a really interesting time from a crisis communications perspective, because NASA's communications performance at the Challenger accident was indeed kind of disastrous. I mean, not to use a pun there, but it was a terrible communications performance for a lot of reasons we're going to talk about a little bit later. But I was part of the people that had gone through that. I was working with them. I heard a lot about it. It's very fortunate to work with great people there. There had been a lot of turnover because being a communications person at NASA during that time frame was just very tough to endure. But I got to be a part of the best part of it, of the return to flight, which was just fabulous, right? STS-26 then. So And I didn't really plan to stay at NASA for a long period of time at that point. You know, you're young, you don't know what you're going to do, right? So I thought maybe I'd be there 5, 10 years and move on to do something else. But you know, I blinked, and suddenly it was 38 years, Tom,
Wow.
because the job was so fortunate to have a job that you get very engrossed in, and it makes time fly. And it's one mission after another, and always new things happening, and exciting. You know, it's always a job of moments, right? But
Mhm.
so many moments at NASA that happened that the time just flew by, and I was extremely privileged to have those opportunities.
Yeah, and there's always a new mission coming up, new things to learn about that, and it just strikes me as an environment where there'd always be something kind of new and exciting if you're willing to jump in and go learn about it.
And I think the thing that makes any job special, tremendous people, right? It's there's no doubt at NASA that you know, I worked with people way smarter than me, and that's a good thing. That helps you that helps you be smarter,
It does.
and so that's a tremendous thing. The team at NASA is unparalleled.
Well, James, one of the cool things that public affairs staff get to do at Johnson Space Center is they do the live commentary during space flights, right? So if we're listening to a mission and we hear this voice come over the top, that is one of the PAO staff who are sitting on the PAO desk there in mission control and interpreting for us laymen what's actually happening there. Now, you were on the PAO desk. This was earlier in your career there in Mission Control back in 2003 when the Space Shuttle Columbia broke apart on entry into Earth's atmosphere. And that was just a horrific situation for NASA. But you were on the desk, and I want to talk to you about what it was like, being there watching all that live. But first, I have a clip that I want to share with you and others, and then we'll talk about it. All right.
This is Mission Control Houston. Flight Director Leroy Kane is instructing controllers to follow contingency procedures. The last communications with the Shuttle Columbia during its descent from orbit were at about 8 a.m. Central Time as it was descending through the atmosphere at an altitude of about 207,000 feet en route to the Kennedy Space Center, Florida, and a touchdown that was anticipated to occur about 2.5 minutes ago. Flight controllers received no further communications with the spacecraft after about 8 a.m. Central Time, and no further tracking data from the spacecraft was gained from C-band tracking radar at the Merritt Island Tracking Station in Florida.
Your voice was so calm through that, James, but you worked with the shuttle program for a while now. You knew the people. What was it like being on the desk for that?
Yeah, interesting, Tom, because I'm listening to that clip, and actually, it's a little hard to keep my voice calm after hearing it. To be honest with you, it was a very tough day. You know, forever burned in the memory, of course, everything about it. I will say, I have to put it in context for your audience, though. Is that was probably it was the 14th or 15th time I had done a launch and landing in mission control, doing the voice of that. I think I've done that more than anybody else ever did for the space shuttle, or at least even with anyone, maybe one other person. But I'd done also, in addition to that, doing all the other phases of a shuttle flight where you're working around the clock, 9-hour shifts in mission control to do the voice all constantly through a launch to landing. We did the broadcast. I'd done more than 80 shuttle flights over the preceding 20 years, 30, so not 20, 10, 15 years, whatever. So, I had a lot of experience
Hmm.
going into that day, and you train for that. There's not there's a lot of self training that goes into it, right? There are people, we have commentators who are experienced who help you train. They tell you what you need to do. You have to self motivate. You go in and you will listen to a lot of simulations, right? You'll go in, the flight control team trains as well, right? And you train with them, because what you have are simulations where crew members are in another building in a simulated spacecraft, and they're training. and you have the flight control team in mission control and their training, and you have a different little cadre of folks called the simulation supervisors who are largely regarded as devilish at NASA, because they are designed to come up with difficult situations for you to deal with, for the crew to deal with, for the flight control team to deal with. And as the communications person, we would be in mission control with them on many of those, understanding what was going on, learning what was going on in these anomalous situations. You had to learn the shuttle, which was a really difficult thing. And even more so the space station, which was even a more complex machine. The shuttle was the most complex machine ever built at the time. Space station has outweighed that. It's way more complex. But you had to learn those things. You had to learn how to explain the jargon back and forth between mission control and the ground, which is a jumble of acronyms. Right? It can be, Atlantis will be AOS in 5 and will be LOS in 5 and gain AOS at 2:30. You need to proceed with a panel flip on panel A1, switch B, and we have to say we're going to lose communications with the shuttle for about a minute and a half, and they're going to turn on a wastewater dump when they come back, so that people know what's happening. That's a large part of what we were as interpreters. But you don't have time to ask anybody what that means. You have to learn it because it's all real time. And especially in a crisis, in a critical situation, you can't interfere with the technical experts that are in mission control that are doing the job of preserving the mission and attempting to preserve the spacecraft. So all of that practice, I worked in mission control for thousands of hours doing the actual broadcast. More thousands of hours practicing. I spent way more time in mission control practicing than I ever did actually executing. And you don't start doing the more critical phases of flight till you've gained a certain level of proficiency at it, of course, right? So you move up, and that's kind of judged by your peers in communications as to how you do that. So I was at the top of proficiency at the time that I was doing the Columbia landing. I will also say that the more that you do that, in some senses, sometimes it works against you, right? Sometimes you I've always told people you can't be comfortable doing that job. You should be confident. Should never get comfortable. I told people that, the people that worked for me and that I would be training and would bringing on, that if you're comfortable, you are not situationally aware of where you are and what you're doing and what's taking place. So don't ever tell me you're comfortable. Tell me you're confident, stay calm, but don't be comfortable. But I had been there a lot before on that one. And it was I will take you into the day a little, and I'm going to go backward in a minute, but for that day, right, it was just a very quiet Saturday morning. It was going to be a landing on a Saturday morning, which is not going to get much news coverage, right? If you wanted to pick a time when you're not going to get much news coverage, it's Sunday morning is probably best. The next best is Saturday morning, right? Of course, that wasn't why we were landing then. We were landing then just because that's how orbital dynamics worked out, and that's what the laws of physics were. But it was going to be a quiet morning, right? And you go in. I'd been into mission control the day before, because you go in with the entry team the day before. I wasn't working the rest of the mission, just the entry on console. So did that as preparation on the Friday before, but then Saturday came in for the real thing. Probably came in there about, it was maybe a little after midnight or 1 a.m. The biggest thing about the mission at that point to me, about the commentary I was going to do, was that it was going to fly over the continental United States, right, on its way back to Florida, which was rare. It was pretty rare that we had a shuttle, because most went to space station then too, which wouldn't bring you back on that trajectory. So it was going to come across the continental United States. Everybody could see it from California all the way to Florida, and it's an amazing sight. I hope there are people that saw shuttle reentry going across the U.S. It's truly beautiful. It was a truly beautiful sight, and so I was really intent on telling people where to watch for it and when, and tracking that descent all across the U.S., because the shuttle's descent was an amazing feat of engineering. As it transitioned from spacecraft to aircraft.
So your commentary as you're running along there is telling them approximately where they are, altitude, time to touchdown, all of that. Providing those
and when they're going to be visible at certain major cities, and giving them heads up for people who are going to be watching. So, and then interpreting anything the crew's saying, right? And the status of the vehicle systems, right? Everything's in good shape or not, right? And of course, as we begin to descend, everything was normal. That's nominal, they call it, but everything going well. As we got really over the central U.S., southwest central U.S., we did get indications that we were losing readings from instruments around the wheel wells of the shuttle, right? And then on the left wing.
Temperatures were
And
rising, right?
I'm sorry.
Temperatures were rising.
Yes, well, it wasn't really super clear. Yeah, they're rising, but it wasn't super clear everything that was happening, right? The actual indications didn't make any sense. Now we'll have to backtrack for you a little bit. Is that
Okay.
I had a dual role, right? I ended up doing the console job, the commentary, the voice on Columbia's landing. But at the time, I was also and had been for several years a role that I had off and on during my career at that point as the lead communications person for the space shuttle program in Houston. So I worked really closely with multiple space shuttle program managers over the years. At that time, I was working really closely with Ron Dittemore, who was the shuttle program manager at the time of Columbia, who was an amazing person and was a great manager for the shuttle. But I'd worked very closely with him, so I was not on the mission. I was working in that capacity during Columbia's mission, so I had seen and been part of looking at the foam insulation that had come loose from the shuttle during the launch. I don't know if people all refreshed around the root cause of Columbia was that very low density foam that is used on the shuttle's big orange external tank to insulate the super cold liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen that are held in the tank as propellants. To insulate them, a large piece of that had come off and had struck the shuttle, struck the front edge of the wing. We didn't know that for sure from the video we saw real time in the flight, but had struck the shuttle or its underside. And you saw that. We saw that on cameras at launch. We didn't have near as many cameras as we put in later to look at launch, but they did analysis of the video of launch always in the day or two after launch, and that was very clearly seen. And it was analyzed, thoroughly analyzed at the time. We had media questions about it. I had prepared responses for all of those. The analysis had shown that there did not any indication that it would pose a safety issue for the shuttle on entry, right? From everything that they knew at the time, right? I'm getting off a little bit on the commentary part, and I'll go back to that. But it had shown really that it might impact the underside tiles around the landing gear doors or something in that area, but it would not in a way that would cause significant damage or concern for the heating of the shuttle on reentry. Was not any thought process that it would hit the front edge of the wing and actually fracture the reinforced carbon on the wing, which is indeed what had happened. That reinforced carbon, very solid. This foam, just so you know, intuitively, it doesn't fit common sense that could happen. The foam is so low density and so lightweight by design. You could hold probably a 10-foot section of it in your hand and almost feel like you're holding nothing, right? It was like a marshmallow or less, Yeah. So it was not intuitive that could have happened. Now, rocket scientists, and in hindsight, it's very clear that was easy to understand that it could have happened and that it could have damaged the carbon. Very strong part of the heat shield too, made on purpose to do that. It wasn't the silicon heat tiles that are underneath the shuttle. It was a very rigid, strong material. Mm-hmm. So anyway, when I heard the calls during the entry of the loss of sensors and these types of things, and I also, when everyone in the room heard them, their mind immediately went to the potential damage from the foam, right? It went in the back of your head. But not conclusive as to what could occur, right? And in that room, you're not looking at why things happen necessarily unless they help you understand what to do now, right? Your training in there is, what do we need to do to fix whatever problem there is and keep the mission intact and the crew safe and bring them home? So that's what everybody focuses on. when we heard that, then very shortly afterward, there was a call up to the crew to tell them we saw it. That was normal. We would say we saw this so that they knew that we're looking at it. And the crew started to respond and were cut off. Now the shuttle, as it's coming in to land, it's like I said, its entry is amazing, and it banks very steeply. It'll bank 90 degrees, a wing pointing down toward Earth, one pointing up toward space, and it kind of fishtails through the air. Right, it really does. That's how I look at it. It's fishtailing like a car, fishtailing through the air, and it switches banks about 4 times as it's coming in to slow down. That's how it slows down. It really puts its heat shield forward and just banks through to slow down and keep it on track toward the runway, toward the landing site. And when it does those banks, it loses communications, right? Because the antennas that are on top of the shuttle that are used for communications get blocked by the heat flow and the plasma. So an abrupt drop in communications is not something that causes immediate alarm in the control room. My job as a communicator was listening to that and to continue to call out where the shuttle was. I pointed out that we weren't receiving live telemetry from it anymore, which I usually did whenever we lost it, whether it was normal or whatever. And then I think the telling factor was very shortly after that. We were supposed to, it was supposed to gain, instead of communications through the satellite network, it's supposed to gain communications through a ground tracking station in Florida called the Merritt Island Tracking Station, MILA. And MILA also is a radar as well. It's a ground radar. And we used it to, it verified that the shuttle's speed and its descent rate and its altitude, its track was the same as what the onboard navigation was saying. Here's ground truth to show that it is and show that everything's fine and it's gone. So it was a normal thing that we would incorporate that. So you had the radar and the tracking from Merritt Island. But what was seen pretty quickly is the ground officer there in Mission Control reported that Merritt Island was only picking up, in his words, what he said on the flight was multiple targets, which when you heard that and knowing what was supposed to happen, you knew that the shuttle had broken apart because there are no multiple targets that exist. And so at that point, my job was to continue really to call out the last status, which I did. And then, very quickly thereafter, there was footage on the news and people in the news. And we were hearing in Mission Control through some people were hearing from people that had been observing it that they had seen it start to break apart from the ground. Right. And at that point, we went into contingency mode. You heard, the clip you played was when they started to go to contingency mode, which means they locked the doors in the room to preserve all the data because it's going to be part of an investigation. My job then switched to talking about the recovery and safety, right? Get out information for the safety of individuals on the ground because, the shuttle had broken apart and the pieces were falling across East Texas primarily, but also a swath from East Texas to Louisiana. The shuttle uses very, very toxic chemicals for propellants. So people could potentially be harmed if they approach debris, right? So we wanted to warn them of that. So I started doing that extensively.
Were you shifting gears then, James, from the PAO commentary role to your shuttle program support role?
Well, I think that's not really. I'll tell you when I shifted gears on that. This is really all real time. This is I don't know how to equate this to industrial capacity. That's not space, but maybe it's the operations of the plant or the factory, right? I'm still talking about the operations of the factory, and the operations are not going normally, and there's a problem happening, and it's dangerous. And I'm having to give out real time information about it. Maybe that's it because I've got a whole planet watching me, So I'm busy. So I'm doing that, right? And that goes on for a while. And that is all according to our communications contingency plan, right? We had a very well, and we had practiced this, and I'll talk about this in a minute. But really the key linchpin in that plan during that time was that everything that NASA said would come from that person in mission control, right? Who's providing information out real time. There would be a statement put out, but it just really quotes that person and just really issues that. And that's because that's the person in the know. That's the person that has all the information. That person is trusted because they've prepared. As I told you, the preparation is extensive to be doing that. You do have access to lead to high management there right next to you in the control room if you need to ask them. And I did talk to them once the situation was not a flight situation. I did have the ability to talk to leadership that was in the room to verify certain things that I was going to say about the ground and the potential for debris and these kind of things. So I continued that for quite a while now. Probably the transition from doing the real-time communications of the space flight to my job as the communications lead there in Houston for the shuttle was when the program manager came down. They usually sat in a room that was above mission control with a window looking down on it, and he came down and came up to me and we exchanged a few words, and we knew a press conference was imminent then, because one of our first things was to put together a press conference soon after an incident. And it really hadn't struck me much thinking about my job as the shuttle program communications, because I was so engrossed in that. And he said, I'm going to need talking points from you. And then wham, like a ton of bricks, my other job hit me quickly, And then we signed off the air. We sign off the air once we have a time for a press conference, right? And so we set up that there will be a press conference, and then I signed off the air. And then really I had to go to the recovery meeting. There's a meeting that came right away that was chaired by all the mission managers team.
And that's going to do it for this episode of the Leading in a Crisis podcast. Thanks for being with us. And again, if you want to drop me an email, that's tom@leadinginacrisis.com. And we'll see you again soon for another episode. Take care.